The autumn wind had a way of speaking in plain sentences across the low fields, and Ruth Yoder stood at the sagging gate, listening as if the cold could tell her what to do next. The house on the hill leaned into the sky like an old prayer, its white paint peeled to gray wood, and the smell of damp straw and spent coal rose from the broken chimney in thin sighs. Her skirt clung damply to her calves, her hands were raw from the journey, and her little ones clung to her skirts like seedlings to soil. Behind her, Esther, Levi, and Miriam looked up with faces the color of dawn, and Ruth felt the weight of years and hunger settle into the bones of the place. She had inherited this farm, and no promise came with it except a single, small iron key. If you are watching from somewhere warm, tell me, where do you listen to this story now? Because what Ruth found under that kitchen floor would unmake and remake more than a home. Stay with me, because what she unearthed would ripple beyond her family, and the wind would not be the only thing changing the shape of that valley. Weeks would pass with frost and rain, then a louder winter, and then the stirrings of spring. And through all of it, a secret breathed beneath the floorboards like a sleeper waiting to be woken. Ruth had walked miles to claim a house no one else wanted, and when she set foot upon the threshold, the boards groaned in recognition, as if they remembered the hands that once lifted them. She bent, felt the grain of the wood under her palm, and found a seam gone wrong. Her candle threw an anxious tongue of light into the room, and beneath the floor a rough trapdoor lay padded with dust and small nails. She lifted it, and a hollow coolness breathed up, carrying the scent of old paper and damp cloth. At the bottom of the ladder, in a pocket of shadow, someone breathed as if alive and afraid, and Ruth had to decide then whether to close the door and count loss as fate, or to pull a stranger from the dark into the risky, hard kindness of her house. The man was a young man, or he had been a young man once, with a beard stubbled into his jaw and a coat stitched by hands that knew the sea of work rather than the careful stitching of a seamstress. He lay curled with a blanket pulled across his chest, a bandage around his head soaked in a brown that was not quite old blood, but not cured either. His breath came in short, ragged notes, and when he opened his eyes, they were the color of iron filings, wary and bright, as if he had been watching for danger for a very long time. Ruth called out his name the first night, because names make people real, and he said, "Samuel, Samuel Hochstetler," and when she touched his wrist, the pulse was a small, stubborn drum. She had given him tea, thick with milk, and wrapped his feet in dry cloth, and his fingers closed weakly around the hem of her shawl, as if to say thank you without slurring the sound. That first moment, the impossible had slipped into her world, and you might have looked away then, but the question would stay. Would she keep this secret, hide him where no one would find, or would kindness become a danger that hatched a storm? The house had been empty for 3 years, ever since Amish Yoder, Ruth's husband, had died in a fever that took him in the space of 3 weeks. Ruth had scraped and sewn and auctioned what little jewelry they had, and she had walked east for work and west for word, until the judge put his hand to a worn seal and gave her the title. It was not much. The roof let rain through in rows, the well had gone shallow, the born roof sagged like an apology to the cattle that drifted in the lane, and the maize in the fields had not been tended since Amos fell ill. Yet on the first day, amid the smell of damp earth and the scalding relief of a kitchen fire, Ruth felt a small steadiness settle. Her children began to measure the rooms with their small feet, and old furniture returned from neighbors who remembered the family with polite sorrow. The community of plain people that lived there watched from a distance, the bishop among them, whispering about proper procedure and sin and duty. And yet a few faces softened when Ruth spoke, because she had been one of them, and kinship carries weight even in narrow times. Samuel was not what the church expected. He had a name that drew curiosity, and his hands told stories of carts and ledger books and the kind of toil that kept towns fed but made no one rich. In the days that followed the first rescue, Ruth and Samuel exchanged cautious conversation in the kitchen under the sputter of the lamp. and their dialogue lengthened into a pattern of trust that smelled of boiling porridge and mending. They spoke in whispers at first when the children slept, then louder when the little ones were at the well with Esther, learning how to carry a pail. Ruth asked Samuel where he had come from, and he said he had been traveling for work, that he had been keeping papers for people who owed him nothing in the way of gratitude. When pressed, he said nothing about names, but he left crumbs of story that grew into suspicion, and then into a map of a life not quite his own. The trapdoor that hid Samuel was only the beginning of what lay beneath. The first night he slept by the stove, with a wet rag on his head, and Ruth found a leather-bound book beneath his pillow. It was thick with dust and filled with cramped script and lists of names and dates, and when she turned the pages, the candlelight trembled over the margins like a secret offered at the edge of the world. The book smelled of ink and mortar and something older, the kind of smell that pulls at the past like a plow pulling at roots. Ruth recognized some of the names because they were the same that had been whispered at the store and in the market, names of workers who had disappeared from the mine, and beside them were sums and dates and the faint scribble of initials. If you have ever held a ledger that has the power to indict, you know the way the paper becomes a weight on the heart. This was the sort of object that could topple a man of power, and Ruth realized with a rush that what lay under her floor was not only a person in need, but evidence that could change the standing of the landholder who had long held the valley in a slow grip of fear. The second block of time in Ruth's life was the slow unspooling of the house and the discovery of how much work a broken home takes. She and Samuel worked side by side on the ridge of roofs, the smell of tar and hay and fresh sawdust mingling in the air, and they spoke in a rhythm that was part work and part confession. The house had many small voices, the floor that complained, the window that rattled like a patient, the stair that remembered someone running down it and had been empty since. Each repair was a story told again. They found a nest of mice in the pantry, the pots all warped from heat, and the bread box full of memory. Sensory life was thick in their days. The taste of strong coffee warmed them in the morning. The texture of dry wood under their palms taught them the patience of sanding. The sound of the children playing with old scraps echoed in the rafters. The light coming through patched windows turned dust into gold motes, and the cold that pricked at their fingers in the evenings reminded them of all that had been lost. The neighbors came with tools and gossip. Levi Miller brought a new window frame he had made from oak. Naomi Lapp, who taught the little ones reading, offered to keep Miriam on weekday afternoons. Jonas Weiss, the shopkeeper, dropped in sacks of flour, and the merchant Isaac Fisher lent a ladder without interest. There were 5 hands ready to help, and 2 that watched with eyes narrowed. Ruth learned how to stitch a roof, and Samuel learned how to hush a baby with a low hum that echoed the voice of the pump. They were building something more than boards. One evening, as rain tapped like a secret on the tin, Samuel and Ruth sat near the iron stove and spoke quietly about the ledger. Her candle threw their faces into a small brightness, and his voice, when he spoke, was rough from thirst and from the unspooled worry of being hunted. He told her, in the way men tell what must be said, slowly, that the ledger contained names of men who had been paid to keep silent, and dates that matched the days when men had never come back from the mine. Ruth listened while the world outside blurred into rain, feeling the page under her fingers as if it were a map that could lead them to truth. He named Ezra Klein, the landowner with a taste for clean houses and cleaner accounts, who owned the sleuths and the rights to the mine, and whose fingers reached into town offices like a man pruning a vine. The air tightened, and the lamp trembled as if it too had heard the name. This revelation was a small explosion. It promised a road to justice, but it also promised reprisal. "If you were in Ruth's place, what would you do?" she asked the audience quietly, as if the camera could answer, because silence is a kind of complicity, and mercy is often a dangerous tool. They moved carefully. The community among which Ruth lived was bound by pacts of faith and a strict code, and outsiders were measured with suspicion.
Bishop Conrad Stoltz came to the farm one afternoon with his hat in his hands and eyes like wind hardened into judgment. He spoke of charity and caution in equal measure, and at the threshold he said that the community would pray and decide. Some thought hiding Samuel was wrong, some thought the ledger was a thing best given to authorities, and some thought the farm had enough trouble without inviting a quarrel with Ezra Klein. There was a small voice of righteousness from Anna Fisher, the midwife, who said that life had to be protected first, and a more practical voice from Jonas that said they should make copies of the ledger before anyone else saw it. Fisher and Naomi agreed to write the names in their careful letters. Levi Miller offered to take the ledger to the county and speak to the sheriff, Thomas Brandt, a slow man who believed in paper and in the quiet of lawful process. But Ezra Klein did not wait for law to catch up to him. The man had a way of making rumor into currency. He owned the mill and several acres beyond the valley, and he had friends in the market who would not hesitate to call men to his bidding. Ruth felt the valley growing small around her, like an animal under watch. The rescue and the first nights of care created a tenderness of attention between Ruth and Samuel that the children saw with bright suspicion and budding hope. There were long evenings when Ruth braided hair by lamplight and Samuel mended a leaky pail beside the stove. Their conversations were turned toward practicalities at first, and then toward small confidences that fit in like new boards. Scene after scene of domestic life was fleshed by the senses. The taste of thick potato soup warmed Levi's small hands. The scent of beeswax on a candlemaker's sample filled the kitchen during a repair. The roughness of Samuel's palms as he lifted beams was the same roughness as some of the men who had worked the mine. The sound of horses returning from market clattered across the yard. The cold seeped in through the joints and made everyone draw nearer to the fire. Dialogue there was frequent and steady. Ruth asked about Samuel's past, and he spoke of a ledger and names and a ledger he had tried to burn before fear found him again. He said he had worked in town, keeping accounts for men whose names were polite when spoken, but hungry when acted upon. He did not say he was a whistleblower, yet what he said pulled the shape of it like a net pulls fish. For each question Ruth asked, Samuel answered in the sort of measured sentences that come from a man who had lived with consequence for company. The integration and the repairs went on for weeks and brought a small cohort of helpers and several named neighbors into the orbit of Ruth's household. Sarah Yoder, a cousin, brought quilts and soup and stories that made the children giggle. Isaac Fisher came with a whetstone and advice about selling butter in town. Naomi Lapp taught Esther her letters and how to press seams so they would not fray, and Levi Miller took his hammer like a prayer. Each helper had a role, and each left with something changed. There was a warm scene by the barn where Samuel taught Levi how to harness a horse. The smell of hay and horse and leather strong enough to make Ruth close her eyes and breathe gratitude. There was a scene at the table when Jonas Weiss argued over whether they should take the ledger to the sheriff, and the bishop counseled prayer before action. The children listened to grown talk and learned the hard lesson that truth often required sacrifice. The sensory detail multiplied. The scratch of pen on paper as Naomi copied a ledger, the weight of the book as Jonas lifted it with a napkin to protect the binding, the grit of sawdust in the nails they drove to patch the porch, the warmth of sunlight catching on Jacob's face as he painted the shutters a hopeful blue, and the metallic taste of worry that sometimes coated Ruth's tongue when she thought of Ezra Klein's reach. Out of the new rhythm came the backstory that would explain why Ruth would risk everything. Ruth's life before the farm was a ledger of small losses and stubborn hope. She had been born in a small lane beside a creek, the daughter of a man who worked the mill and a mother who taught the children to read psalms by the light of a tallow candle. At 13, she had learned to sew, and at 16, to bear fear with a folded face. She married Amos at 20, and they built what little they could with hands that were rarely idle. Ruth had watched a brother die in the mine before the law had named the accident,
and she had watched Amos's health yield to a disease that had no name at the local doctor's book. She had taken in sewing and washed for neighbors, carrying babies at the market with a song on her lip to shield the ache in her chest. When Amos died, she had to decide whether to sell the land and keep moving, or to stay and plant a stubborn claim of home. She chose the latter because her children needed more than roofs, they needed history. This backstory was not long as a legend, but it was dense like the soil in the field, full of roots that explained why she would not abandon the house and why she would not leave Samuel to the dark. It took 3 paragraphs of small memory, the smell of Amos's tobacco pipe, the time she had nursed a neighbor through a fever, the way her mother had taught her to count pennies and blessing, to make clear that Ruth's courage grew from a life of knitting together phrase into cloth. The antagonist's past arrived in fragments, a narrower band of shadow that explained his appetite for land and his laugh at contracts. Ezra Klein was a man raised on profit and the slow learning that men with money could purchase silence. His father had been a mill owner who had taken advantage of laws that left safety as an optional cost, and Ezra had learned that a tidy ledger could be an instrument of power. He had risen in town because he knew how to send men away when trouble pressed and how to ensure a town council remembered his name when it came time to vote. Ezra had a wife who tolerated him and a son who preferred hunting to managing accounts, and he cultivated friends in the county office like a man planting stakes to hold a fence. When the mine workers began to disappear, Ezra's response was not grief, but containment, and the ledger that Samuel now held was the record of his decisions and payments. This backstory filled out in 2 to 3 paragraphs the sort of description that made him a figure not merely of greed, but of methodical, quiet cruelty. A man who preferred the legality of silence to the messiness of confession. He was named by Samuel with a kind of flat anger that made Ruth clench her jaw, because Ezra was not merely a person, but a system that bent small lives into his design. Pressure grew in the valley like sap in a tree in spring. The townsfolk whispered, and a tone of fear vibrated through the marketplace. And Samuel and Ruth agreed they could not hide the ledger forever. They needed witnesses, allies, and a plan. 2 of the most tense moments of their lives unfolded in 3 paragraphs that tightened the air. The first came when a rider in Ezra's livery was seen on the road at dawn, his horse moving with the purpose of a man who was no stranger to orders. The community paused. The second tension came when the sheriff Thomas Brant arrived and asked to see the ledger. He was a slow man, a careful man, and when Ruth put the book in his hands, she felt the world tilt. The ledger was a small, heavy thing, and the sheriff's fingers closed around it as if he felt its danger. The third came as night fell, and men lit lanterns and walked the ridge to find the walls of the mine and the sluice Ezra owned. They found evidence of recent work, the earth still turned, and a scent of oil in the air that did not belong to honest toil. Each paragraph of these moments was dense with breathless detail. The scrape of iron against stone, the heat of lantern light on faces, the odor of wet leather and human fear. They were police-like, tight, with a rhythm that pushed the reader forward while squeezing at the heart. Confrontations came like weather. Words first, then legal motions, then the terrible physicality of men in the night. Ezra's men came one late evening to the Yoder house under the pretense of asking for town council. They walked into Ruth's yard with boots that ground the gravel, their jackets smelling of smoke and fast horses. Samuel met them at the gate, his back braced as if against a wall. The dialogue here unfurled with the intensity of a small courtroom. Ezra's emissary named Samuel a liar and threatened to take him to the county if he did not hand over the ledger. Samuel refused. It is in the nature of evil to escalate, and the emissary left with a threat like a promise. The next day, a man left a note nailed to the Yoder gate, a coarse message that said, "Leave and you will be spared." Ruth read it aloud, her voice steady but thin, and she felt the letters scrape her skin like thorns. The community was split. Jonas wanted to go to the town and speak openly.
Bishop Stoltz counseled prayer while he weighed the morality of public disclosure. Naomi argued for copies to be made and kept in 3 separate hands. Sarah offered the barn as a place to hide the ledger.
With bales of hay. The sensory load of these scenes was heavy. The smell of oil from Ezra's men, the metallic tang in the air after the note was nailed, the taste of stale bread as they ate quickly and planned, the sound of a distant train that carried rumors faster than horses, and the feel of the ledger's binding under Ruth's fingers were all present and pressing. The plan to take the ledger to county was more dangerous than any of them wished to admit. The journey to a courthouse required crossing a bridge over a swollen river, and traveling at night to avoid being seen meant moving as shadows move. Samuel proposed that he would go with Levi and Jonas to make the filing, while Ruth would remain with the ledger's copies held by Naomi and Sarah, each one sworn to secrecy. The dialogue before they left was long and full, because it had to be. Ruth told Samuel to be careful. Samuel told Ruth he would not risk the boys by leaving them. They argued as people argue when the stakes are names and lives and the idea of justice. The ride was tense and the light of the moon was thin, but they moved. As they crossed the bridge, men in Ezra's pay stepped from behind trees like cutouts from a fear play and blocked the path. The chase that followed was a long scene of breath and mud. Samuel ran with a speed he had learned in other lives, and Jonas was thrown and banged as men tried to grab the ledger. Levi was struck and blood warmed his temple. The tension of that escape was a scene in itself with 5 to 6 sensory details. The slap of mud against boots, the near smell of river water like a breath that could take you, the rasp of fabric against raw skin, the starless sky pressing down, and the taste of iron in the mouths of the running men. They escaped by a hair, and the ledger reached the town clerk where Thomas Brant received it and logged the complaint. There was a court day scheduled, and the valley held its breath. The trial was a small theater of grief and courage. Ezra Klein appeared in town with a lawyer imported from the county seat, a man who spoke in smooth sentences and owned a coat too fine for the weather. The courtroom was crowded with people who had come to watch the fall of a mighty man or to watch a scandal. Ruth sat in the back with her children who clung to her skirts, and Samuel sat near the front, his hand on Leah's shawl as if to steady himself. The prosecution read passages from the ledger, and there was a hush as the names were spoken aloud. Witnesses came forward, one by one, men with hands calloused by the mine, women who had seen husbands leave and never return, and Naomi read the copies she had held safe. The defense tried to call the ledger a forgery, to make the binding of the pages into an object of doubt. But a family of witness statements and the sting of truth undermined the attorney's calm. Ezra took the stand, and his speech was a theater of rage and contradiction. He denied wrongdoing. He said that accidents happen in mines, and that safety was a complex affair. But his voice failed on the dates that matched the missing men. The verdict, when it came, was not simply a word, but a tearing open of the county's complacency. Ezra was fined, and certain business interests were taken from him. The scene of the reading had a sensory record. The smell of wax on the courthouse benches, the heat of bodies packed in the sun, the rustle of papers that held the ledger's truth, the silence after the verdict, and the taste of relief like raw bread that takes time to chew. The aftermath came with both relief and fracture. Ezra's men left the valley, but not without damaging crops and burning a shed in the dead of night. The Yoder family repaired what they could with the help of friends and neighbors. There was a wedding offer that surprised Ruth and everyone around her. Samuel's presence had been a strange gift that had grown into more than gratitude. He had steadied to the place in ways that made it clear he would not leave. One evening near harvest, when the leaves were a blaze of copper, Samuel took Ruth's hands after the children had gone to sleep and spoke in a voice softened by the knowing of shared labor. He asked if she would consider joining their lives, not as a possession, but as a partnership. Someone who wanted a home and wanted to plant roots rather than keep moving. Ruth looked at him and then at her children asleep.
and she saw in the kitchen light the possibility of a table broad enough for more than bread. The community spoke of blessing, and Bishop Stoltz gave a blessing that felt at once formal and tender. The proposal was an offering of safety and mutual repair, a way of saying, "We will hold one another." The reaction was a mixture of joy and gossip, because small towns gossip as naturally as the rain falls. The resolution of public justice did not mean private scarring disappeared. There were those in town who would not forgive Samuel for the trouble he had brought, nor Ruth for sheltering him. Ezra appealed the verdict, and the legal process dragged on like a river that would not settle. Yet the Yoder house became a symbol in the valley. The porch was mended with the nails Levi had forged, the paint on the shutters shone a modest blue, and a small sign of solidarity appeared in the market where Naomi wrote a small notice asking for labor to help rebuild a part of the barn. People came. Sarah Yoder taught the children to embroider, and Jonas sold eggs at a lower price to help the family recover from lost harvest. The work of reconstruction was not merely about wood. It was about trust and about the small acts of courage that build a community. The farm shifted from being a broken thing to being a place where hands kept the promise of shelter. There were moments of tension that had to be told with a compressed weight because they reshaped the lives of the main players. One such moment occurred when Ezra's appeal drew a private investigator to the valley who tried to bribe Naomi to recant her testimony. The smell of money in the air was a bitter thing. Naomi refused, and the investigator left with a curt nod, but the pressure returned. Another tense moment was when the barn burned in the night, and the children woke to the smell of smoke and a sky red as hot iron. The barn's destruction felt like a personal assault. They pulled wet blankets over smoldering beams, and the community came with water and stoic hands. The last tense moment was the secret meeting where Ruth and Samuel decided to plant the ledger's copies in different places, so that if a chapter of danger returned, they could reconstruct the truth from memory. In each of these moments, the sensory details were thick. The taste of metal when the investigator slid change across the table, the grit of ash on Ruth's fingers as she scooped water, the ubiquitous feel of damp straw underfoot, and the sound of the children sobbing into sleeves were all present. The tension played out not in grand gestures, but in these small, visceral pieces. As things settled into a new beat, the offer of a new life became real. The community, which had at first been cautious, now slowly tilted toward repair. An initiative to form a cooperative was born in the wake of Ezra's fall. Jonas Weiss and Isaac Fisher proposed a share system for work and produce that would reduce dependence on single owners. The idea spread through market talk and found favor with those who had felt the sting of contractual binds. Bishop Stoltz blessed the plan with words that sounded like a prayer and a policy, and the county clerk gave small but actual support in the form of advice and documents. The farm became a hub for the plan. Ruth began to teach other women how to balance books and hold ledgers, turning the object that had been a weapon into a tool. Samuel arranged with the mill that the workers could deliver grain to the cooperative and receive fair price. The transformation was practical and symbolic. Where once the valley had bent to a single heavy hand, now there was talk of mutual aid and cooperation. Shared barns. The children ran through plots of newly planted beans in the spring, their laughter a kind of harvest that warmed Ruth more than any bread. The epilogue comes in 3 times to show the measure of change, and it is told with the plainness it deserves, marked by small details that are proof of life renewed. 1 month after the verdict, the farm had a new roof over the kitchen and a repaired well pump that sang clear when the children drew water. There was a small celebration, with bread and beans, and Ruth invited Naomi and Sarah and Levi to the table. The ledger had been secured in the town records and copies kept by the bishop and by Thomas Brandt. The children had begun school with Naomi as their teacher, and the schoolroom smelled of chalk and sun-warmed wood. Samuel and Ruth had begun to speak openly of marriage and planning a ceremony that would be modest and true. The community had donated a fence post and some nails, and the barn stall where the burned hay had been showed the newness of hope. People came by to offer small congratulations and to bring stones for a new hearth. The 1-month mark felt like a patch laid over a bruise. 3 months later, the cooperative had its first ledger of transactions, and the idea had spread to 2 neighboring valleys. Jonas had managed the accounts, and Isaac had bargained for fair rates for the farmers. The community had held a gathering in the field where everyone shared a portion of what they had and set a new schedule of mutual work. And the children planted a small orchard in the south field that would feed the village in a few short years. Ruth's table had become a place for meetings, and she had become an informal teacher in matters of budget, credit, and trust. Samuel had found decent work at the mill, and a small shop agreed to share part of its earnings with the workers' committee. Ezra's appeal had failed, and his assets were being divided to repair damage done to workers, and there was a tentative law being drafted at the county level demanding safer mine practices. The valley was not fixed, but it had become more fair. 6 months from that first discovery, the change was visible and stubborn. The house on the hill no longer leaned into the sky with complaint. The paint shone, and the yard was filled with the sound of children at play. The barn was whole, painted by hands that had learned to work together. The cooperative had established a small fund for emergency aid and a plan for shared tools. Naomi had started a weekly circle at Ruth's kitchen table to teach women about record-keeping and community rights. Samuel and Ruth were married in a small ceremony that felt honest and unadorned, and their promise to one another was the truth.
Promise of shared labor and mutual defense. The county had named a new inspector for mines, and the law had been amended to require more oversight and to provide compensation where negligence was proven. Places where people had once felt powerless now held meetings with a proper agenda and minutes taken and filed. After 6 months, the ledger that had begun as a dangerous secret now lived in 3 official places and had been used to set right an injustice that had been hidden for years. Names were read aloud in a memorial service that the community held at the hill where the missing had once been thought forgotten. The ritual of naming healed in small increments. Throughout the story, there were recurring images that tied the narrative together and gave it texture and theme. The house, once broken, stood as the centerpiece of repair, a symbol of how a home can be reclaimed. The secret beneath the floor acted as a hinge that turned the whole village toward justice. The children represented a future that could be steered by the courage of small choices. The antagonist embodied the manner in which economic power exploits labor, and the documents, the ledger and the copies, became the instrument of accountability. Work, from cleaning gutters to drafting petitions, was the metaphor for rebuilding community. People who once turned away now turned toward one another. Names were repeated across the valley until they sounded like a chorus of memory, and the wind that had once held the house to ruin now carried news of a cooperative and of safer minds. If this story moved you, think for a moment what you might have done in Ruth's place. If you would have helped, begin your comment with "I would have helped," and then tell which act you believe would have mattered most. Your words help others imagine courage, and they help us decide which stories to tell next. Now we return to the last scenes of harvest and to the quiet days when the children run and the ledger sits in a safe place, a reminder that truth has teeth and that repair is a work of many hands. In the end, the valley was altered not by a miracle, but by steady hands and by choices that could be made by anyone who heard the cry of another human being. The house on the hill became a center for learning, for complaint, for careful accounting, and for the sound of laughter at supper. The legal precedent set in that small court carried beyond the river, and other towns began to file complaints when negligence had been hidden for convenience. Ruth had not simply inherited a broken farm, she had inherited a responsibility that became a cause. Samuel had come from the dark and found a place that turned out to love him, and their marriage was less a romance than an agreement to shoulder the hard work of a common life.
The cooperative continued to grow. Bishop Stoltz softened his public tone while keeping prayer at the center of communal decisions, and the schoolroom filled with children learning both letters and the weight of civic life. If this story lingered with you, consider telling others, and if you want to read more stories of small places that change, subscribe and be part of a community that believes work and kindness are the same sort of labor. Remember this image when you close your eyes: the house no longer leaning, a child laughing under a wide sky, and a ledger closed but never forgotten, a proof that truth kept safe can change the shape of a valley.